Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Here are the desiderata of my talk and also the outline, so the plan. So I will start by illustrating how people experiencing great existential uncertainty can end up existentially self-identify with something X, id est, believing that they cannot live a meaningful life without X. I will move on to illustrating the mechanism according to which existentially self-identifying people become normatively insulated from concerns in their lives that might counter their existential self-identification, thereby scorching the earth. So this is a metaphor I will be using during this talk around X. And I will end up illustrating how existential self-identifying with a fundamentalist ideology is sufficient for a person to develop an extremist mindset. So the main question I will be tackle is whether existential self-identifying with something is sufficient to be an extremist. Right, so here are some paradigmatic examples of existential self-identification. So after a time of existential crisis and self-doubt, a person realizes that she cannot live a meaningful life without dedicating herself to the production of art. Another example, after many back and forth, it dawns on a lover that his life is not truly worth living without his beloved. And a final example, after a period of disorientation and incapacity to find purpose in life, a person finds in religion a necessary bedrock for meaning in life. Right? So, usually people get to a state of existential self-identification coming from existential distress, which I understand as a severe form of existential crisis in which a person questions all sources of meaning in her life, thereby becoming unable to find her life meaningful. Existential distress is a state of querying self-uncertainty that fuels a quest for full meaningfulness in life, understood in terms of subjective fulfillment and sense of purpose over a significant amount of time that is not momentarily, but rather diachronically. Finding something without which one cannot imagine living such a fully meaningful life amounts to coming to existentially self-identifying with that thing. Right. So here's my understanding of existential self-identification. I'm sorry if I'm a little quick, but I mean, the time is not that much. So here's my understanding, and my doctoral thesis focuses on the defense of this sort of understanding of existential self-identification. A person existentially self-identifies with X if she has a wholeheartedly sincere and conscious belief that X, which or whom she strongly and intrinsically values, is constitutive, that is, contributes to full meaningfulness in life as is necessary for living a fully meaningful life, is constitutive for living a fully meaningful life. So it's necessary. So one thinks that without X, one cannot live a fully meaningful life. When, of course, a person, so given that the person values at all living a fully meaningful life. Right. So there has been some research in social psychology, which I'm not an expert on at all, but still that is promising from my own perspective and relates self-uncertainty to increased conviction and self-identification within groups, or even with a quest. The experience of self-uncertainty motivates a quest to find more social significance. And there have been also attempts to understand sort of why has something gone? Okay, yeah. So these are some models and theories connecting self-uncertainty with increased conviction and self-identification. And there have also been attempts to lump these theories together in terms of a search for meaning in life. Right. Not only that, but also research in social psychology about self-uncertainty have shown correlations between the attempts to overcome self-uncertainty and increased and the tendency to develop more extremist beliefs and mindsets. So here are some examples. So for instance, McGregor found a correlation between experiencing self-relevant uncertainty and increased conviction on polarizing social issues. Hogg found a tendency to identify with social groups that are highly, that have a higher entitativity, that is, they are usually more homogeneous, internally homogeneous. They are easier to separate from the rest of society, and they have strict membership criteria. And finally, there has been also this study from Hales and Williams finding a correlation between ostracism and openness to more extreme positions. Right. So it seems that social psychology tells us that there is not only a correlation between self-identity and increased identification, but also a correlation between self-uncertainty and an interest or a tendency to be more open-minded about extremism in general. Again, nothing of what I've said about social psychology is supposed to give direct proof of what I say about existential self-identification. It just parallel research that echoes what I say about existential self-identification, right? So this is what comes from social psychology. From philosophy, we have a debate about the Frankfurtian concept of wholeheartedness, that is basically being satisfied with one's own volitions and being very decisive in loving or caring for something or someone. And Suzanne Wolf raised the worry that in case one is wholehearted, in face of genuine uncertainty, one might end up just being a zealot, a fanatic, or at least being closed-minded. So we can raise the same question for existential self-identification. Can existential self-identification in and of itself be indistinguishable from an extremist mindset? Right, so let me start by telling you what I mean by an extremist mindset. So I adapt the understanding of extremist mindset from this social psychologist Kruglansky. So he has a much broader definition, and I have a rather narrower one. So I understand an extremist mindset as a consciously endorsed, extraordinarily strong passion or concern for something to the detriment and potential undermining of all other important passions and concerns in a person's life. So where the conscious endorsement of a passion grants that this kind of definition relates to meaning in life, and when we have these being to the detriment of other important concerns and passions and potential undermining all of them, makes it problematic. So it's not just being extremely in love with someone, but maybe being extremely in love with someone to the detriment of other important things in one's life, right? So how can existential self-identification be related to extremism, at least understood in this way? So through Scorching VF. So if put under pressure, existential self-identifying people can actively distance themselves and even undermine other valuable things in their lives for the sake of the X they existentially self-identify with. So this retreat to the X to the detriment of other valuable goals, people, and activities, I call an operation of scorched earth, so metaphorically, of course. So the idea is that although in this analogy there is no enemy approaching, right? So an operation of scorched earth is when you start sort of destroying all resources that might be used by your enemy, right? And you retreat to some other position. So, and the analogy works in this way. So the person who existentially self-identifies with X and feels that X is under threat is going to sort of to actively undermine the things that threaten the X, right? So now I have a slide on why should an existentially self-identifying people just neglect other stuff, but I don't think I have time to go into it, so I will just skip to some examples of scorched earth. Of course, if the question comes up in the Q&A, then I can go back to the slide. So, for instance, an existentially self-identifying artist might begrudgingly, that is actively, neglect her family and friends for the sake of the completion of an artist's masterpiece. An existentially self-identifying lover who has reason to doubt the full commitment of his partner could start disproportionately calling sick at work to spend more time with his beloved, even going as far as risking being fired, when being fired, of course, is considered by his own lights as a dire outcome. a once regular partygoer and lover of spending time outdoors might grievingly seclude herself because of a perceived incompatibility of outdoor activities with the religious convictions with which she extensively self-identifies with. But she thinks she cannot live a meaningful life without. Right. So now we have the connection between my understanding of extremism and scorching the earth. So that is, if put under pressure, a person is going sort of to safeguard X against our threats to the detriment and potential undermining of all our important passions and concerns in life. So again, we raise the main question. Can existential self-identification in and of itself be indistinguishable, be sufficient for one to become an extremist? So I distinguish two senses of the question. A narrow sense in which by existential self-identification in and of itself, I exclude the content, so the content of the X with which one existential self-identifies with, so I just focus on the psychological structure, and a broad sense that includes the content of existential self-identification. So, starting with the narrow sense. So existential self-identification regards meaning in life. So scorching the earth will tend to undermine and insulate one normatively from other sources of meaning in life. Right. However, people have various concerns that have nothing to do with meaning in life. Prudence and morality can be sources of independent normative demands in a person's life that can conflict with the demands of meaning in life. And existential self-identification doesn't make one preemptively commit to meaning in life over meaning-independent prudential and moral concerns. Rather, depending on the situation, the stronger concern might prevail. This means that because of prudential moral reasons, existential self-identifying people might opt for living a meaningless life over, by their own lights, that is, over misery or giving up their moral rectitude. So for instance, one might realize that pursuing a career as an artist would force one into a precarious existence, and so opt for an alternative frustrating career, which however guarantees a minimum of financial stability. Or in the moral case, a person might turn in one's criminal partner, thereby jeopardizing the relationship without which one couldn't fathom living a fully meaningful life. And that, of course, would be sacrificing meaning in life for morality, for this meaning-independent moral concern. Right. So, provided that an operation of scorched earth doesn't necessarily undermine prudence and morality in the life of an existentially self-identifying person, we can always draw a line between existential self-identification and developing an extremist mindset. And so, when asking our main question, the answer for the narrow sense is no. So existential self-identification is not sufficient for someone to become an extremist. But what about the broad sense? What if we consider also the content of X and not just the psychological structure? So intuitively, an extremist content might make existential self-identification indistinguishable from an extremist mindset. However, first, nothing hinders that one existential. So now I sort of deviate from the understanding of extremism I've been having in mind, the technical understanding I've been having in mind thus far. So just thinking about whatever you mean by extremism, right? So a more commonsensical understanding of extremists. So nothing hinders that one existential self-identifies with a commonsensical extremist content, more than one, actually, right? And so it seems that it's not that one is going to be necessarily sacrificed over the other, or the two things are going to be to undermine sort of each other. I don't know. So I think this possibility makes it the case that it is difficult to develop an extremist mindset just because of existential self-identification with an extremist content, irrespective of my definition thus far. Maybe more importantly, there can still be realms, normative realms, independent from meaning in life, that can override the extremist demands of the extremist X with which one existentially self-identify. Yeah. Unless, so and this is the maybe main point of my talk, if the extremist content is such that it tends to breach the separation line between normative realms, it can preemptively override independent prudential and moral concerns. So is there any such X? I think so, and I think this is going to be a fundamentalist ideology. So now, I understand ideology in general, so loosely in terms of ideological thinking, or a way of believing in general stories, claiming to explain even quite disparate events and experiences, potentially belonging to quite different people at different times and places for a unified set of recurring mechanisms, in a way that justifies, in the eyes of the ideological thinker, certain codes of conduct and ways of seeing the world. And the fundamentalist ideology is one such way of thinking that employs those recurring mechanisms as the exclusive basis for all conduct and thinking, to the detriment and potential undermining of independent prudential and moral standards. So nothing hinders that meaning in life sort of overlaps with prudential demands and moral demands. However, in this case, the fundamentalist ideology which might also have like moral aspects and aspects related to prudence and well-being, sort of preemptively blocks any other independent sort of concern to play any role in guiding the conduct of a person. Right. So, given its claim to be all-encompassing, a fundamentalist ideology is ideally placed to counter the excruciating self-doubt of existential distress. In particular, fundamentalist ideologies are often naturally endowed with epistemic defense mechanisms that protect them from the doubt of existential distress. Among other things, the tendency to think in conspiratorial terms or to engage in deflationary revisions, so defending an outrageous, like trying to defend, bringing up like an outrageous claim, but then when pressured to defend it, switch to a more trivially true claim that is easier to defend and going back and forth. So fundamentalist ideologies look like ideal candidates for existential self-identification. So one might say, well, if somebody holds a fundamentalist ideology, we don't need existential self-identification to say that the person is already an extremist. So holding a fundamentalist ideology would already imply being an extremist. I would say that although many people holding fundamentalist ideologies might be extremists, indeed, it is not necessarily the case that holding a fundamentalist ideology commits one to extremism. So claiming otherwise would mean that people having grown up in societies centered around fundamentalist ideologies and not knowing any better somehow cannot feel the independent pull of prudence and morality. And we have this example from Mark Twain's novel Huckleberry Finn, in which Huck, this young white lad, lets his black friend Jim escape, even though he considered Jim escaping as a case of stealing the property of a slave holder, right? So Huck feels guilty of letting his friend escape. So at the more conscious level, he's siding with fundamentalist ideology, of a racist ideology, of thinking that that would be immoral, but his heart, let's say, is in the right place, or at least this is Nomi Arpali's interpretation of this case. So it seems that holding a fundamentalist ideology doesn't necessarily make you an extremist. So I would say that Huck in this case is not an extremist. So I would say that his heart, his more spontaneous being, allows him not to be an extremist. Right. Then, maybe, bringing together fundamentalist ideology and existential self-identification through this operation of scorching the earth makes one an extremist. And I think that's the case. So when a person doesn't merely hold a fundamentalist ideology but existentially self-identifies with it, this person is going to scorch the earth around it, if put under pressure, that is. However, given that the fundamentalist ideologies claim to be all-encompassing, the operation of scorched earth will not stop at the doors of prudence and morality, but rather proceed to the preemptive detriment and undermining of literally all other independent concerns in a person's life, whether related to meaning in life or not. Thus, existentially self-identifying with a fundamentalist ideology is indistinguishable from having an extremist mindset. So, back to our main question, in the broad sense this time, when the X one existentially self-identifies with is a fundamentalist ideology, the answer is yes. So, existential self-identification is indistinguishable from an extremist mindset. So I reached already the conclusion of my talk. So we had our main question. We have a narrow sense where we just focus on the psychological structure. In that case, we can say that existentially self-identifying with something is not sufficient for someone to be an extremist, because there might be independent concerns from morality or prudence. In the broad sense, usually no, unless I have at least one case in which existentially self-identifying with something amounts to being an extremist. That is, when that something is a fundamentalist ideology. So the conclusion is that existential self-identifying with a fundamentalist ideology is sufficient to develop an extremist mindset. So that was it. Thank you very much.